obvious that Washington's and Lee's first allegiance was to their home community and state. Secondly, the South. And finally, third, the new American Union. Community, region, state, or union, and in that order. That's how I'm getting inside this. In that order. That's what makes them both, according to the topic that I have, Southerners. In that order. Region is not loved unless community is loved first and foremost. And the final political order is not loved at all unless region is loved more. Ivan Karamazov, in Dostoevsky's famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov, which I'm sure many of us have read, in his famous novel, Ivan Karamazov tells his little brother Alyosha that it is easy to love humankind, something global, shall we say. But it's the actual neighbor, the old man with the quote-unquote fetid breath you see on your morning walk that is hard to love. If it is even possible, as Ivan confesses, to love at all. I simply don't know what it means to love that fella on my morning walk. Ivan opts for humankind as his first priority and ends up insane, which is the road that all of us are traveling on, for then he loves no one. You'll never meet humankind on your way to work. But the obvious fact that Washington and Lee share the exact same identities and loyalties needs to be defended because, lo and behold, our cultural elites in education, media, government, entertainment, is choosing to go the way of Ivan Karamazov, in choosing to live among abstractions. They were manhandling the progression of loyalties upon which this nation was founded. They're doing so for their own benefit and the obvious destruction of local communities. I mean to peddle my own wares, but listen to the Sons of Bill tune, Joey's Arm, at some point if you want to hear in song what we all know in life, that local communities, especially rural, especially southern, are being completely destroyed. Joey's Arm has 2 tattoos, stars and bars, born to lose. South ain't going to rise again, but we're holding out for Jesus. So they say on AM radio. James says he inherited all of his sadness from me. Though I had been involved in our movement for a number of years, the Southern movement, the full dereliction of the lies that are told about the South and its people struck me hard and completely out of the blue when I was about 12 years ago, when I was taking my wife's parents through the Confederate White House in Richmond. There was a portrait of Washington on the wall of the dining room, and the guide told the crowd of tourists, and I'll quote him, that it seems strange to us now to see a picture of the father of the country in the home of Jefferson Davis. But you need to understand that Southerners thought that they were the champions, imagine that, of Washington's cause, and the ones who were extending his legacy. I had heard many lies about our homeland before, but to me, a Virginian, this was an attack on the given, on the understood, on the accepted, on the treasured. And this, for me, personally speaking, was what Hitler called the big lie that we must always tell. I'll say that the guide was completely scripted, as most guides who are taking people through. They are told what to say. I have a friend who's trying to get a job giving tours at Monticello back home. He's told exactly what to say. But I got him. We ended up in the, just as a big parenthesis. We ended up in the last room was the nursery, and we were looking at all the little cradles and trundle beds and the maid's bed and all this. And then he said, "Thank you, folks. It's been a pleasure to talk to you." And I said, "Hang on a second. Wasn't there an African-American child that was raised in this room?" And his eyes just brightened and his smile came across his face. And he said, "Yes." And my mother-in-law, who's tough, she said, "Well, why didn't you tell us about him?" And for those of you who don't know, Jim Limber, he was a young child who was about 10, I believe it was, who he was lost during the war. Verena Davis found him being whipped on the streets of Richmond, and she took him into their home and raised him as her own. At the end of the war, he was taken away and was sported around the country with the lash marks on his back, saying, "Look at how cruel the Davises were." And he was never seen again. Miss Davis tried for the rest of her life to find him, and couldn't. Was not able to locate him. He vanishes from space and time. But anyway, so these are the sorts of things that we hear. These are the kinds of lies. This is the reason I need to stand up here and talk about these two gentlemen as Southerners who share the exact same train of loyalties. But a story that speaks to all of us. I'm not a historian. I'm a student of fiction as far as my work in this organization is concerned. And so I tell stories. A story that speaks to all of us and might even give the court historians pause. Comes from the pen of a great scholar, easily the greatest scholar of his day, and one of the greatest of all times, Professor Basil Linot Gildersleeve, the classical scholar, born in Charleston, studied at Princeton, got his PhD at Göttingen in Germany, faculty at UVA, and then one of the 5 people handpicked to begin the new Johns Hopkins University, guarded the Rockfish Gap throughout his faculty days in Charlottesville, and was wounded at Weir's Cave and walked with a limp for the rest of his life. In one of his great essays, which we've talked about here at Abbeville, it gives a scene that comes from the Battle of Cheats Mountain, which is now in West Virginia. It was in Virginia at the time, and is recorded in the splendid essay, A Southerner in the Peloponnesian Wars, which I would urge all of you to read if you haven't done so. I'm going to quote him. "We were prepared for a hard fight, for we knew the enemy was strongly posted. Most of us were to be under fire for the first time, and there was some talk about the chances of the morrow as we lay down to sleep. Moralizing of that sort gets less and less common with experience in the business, and this time the moralizing may have seemed to some premature. But wherever the Minnie Ball sang its diabolical mosquito song, there was death in the air. And I was soon to see brought into camp the lifeless body of the heir of Mount Vernon, whose graceful riding I had envied a few days ago." That's John Augustine Washington, the great-great-grandson and namesake of George Washington's brother. This was the first battle death. It's an amazing story. This was the very first battle death witnessed by Gildersleeve. Again, the heir of Mount Vernon. And the great classicist tells us that from then on, the word war became a concrete noun forever. Never again could he think of war in the abstract, with close up and actual. He couldn't think of it as a human institution. Leave aside, think of it as glorious. To say the word was to consider an utter contradiction by violence. Here is the short story, so to speak, of what Lord Acton said of the war, that it was an awful crime. Quote, awful crime, unquote. It was a lie by power that Washington's patrimony would be fostered and extended by destroying his personal heritage. Abstraction defeats concretion. That's the awful lie. That's not what Acton said. That's what I'm getting at, and especially the lies that the sweet fellow was told to say on the tour through Richmond. Here we see a consequence of the disorder of loyalties. Abstract union is glorified at the expense of the father of the union's own child. That's what's happening. Gildersleeve didn't like war to be used the way we often use it, culture war, war on drugs, war on, he couldn't, war was war. It was this contradiction by power, because the first battle death that he saw was the heir to Mount Vernon. But anyway, what we mean by culture war, what we mean by cultural genocide, all those things, which is this. And that's what's so wrong about it, and the awful crime about it. The Washingtons and the Lees had been neighbors in Virginia's northern neck since the ancestors John Washington and Richard Lee settled there in the 1640s. They were not at the top level at the time of the agrarian society, though Washington, though Washington reached the top, when his beloved stepbrother Lawrence Washington married a daughter of Lord Fairfax and inherited Mount Vernon. Lawrence died young. George Washington never got over it. The estate went eventually to George. Robert E. Lee was never really gentry at all. He was born in the stately Stratford Hall, but his father, Henry Lee, by bad luck and bad investments, lost his small fortune and spent a year in debtor's prison, and the Lees moved into a house in Alexandria. Henry Lee, however, was a close and very trusted lieutenant of General Washington during the Revolution. And Washington served with Lees in the Virginia House of Burgesses and twice in Raleigh Tavern when the royal governor dissolved the House of Burgesses. At the Virginia Convention, Continental Congress, and the Constitutional Convention. In that, Washington and Lee were stemmed from Virginians. Earliest settlers both took pride in being British citizens. Again, order of loyalties, Virginians first, then British citizens. Pride in being a British citizen stems from being a Virginian. With all the rights and privileges and protections of British common law. I'm going to talk about common law for just a moment, and I'm going to elaborate more when I talk about John C. Calhoun and Thomas Jefferson on Thursday, in Thursday's lecture. This is really part A of a two-part lecture, so more on this. I'm trying to put it in words that would have been in the mind of Washington right now. To be a British citizen, in fact, to paraphrase M.E. Bradford, was not so much having a heritage, but rather being a heritage. Each man and woman found identity in an unwritten code of social bonds, historic customs, and historically grounded rights, grounded in the political culture that stretched back to antiquity. If the word, as they thought, stretched back to antiquity. If the word history connotes an ordered story and a story of order, then history is itself the bond which made Britain and her colonies a nation. There are bonds prior to their being a nation. The story unfolds as the true path of liberty. The story of this heritage unfolds as the true path of liberty is discovered in time, and tyrants one by one are defeated. John Calhoun, we will remember from past summer schools, and we'll hear again on Thursday, referred to the word constitution, not first of all as a foundation of government, but first and foremost as the historic fabric of customs, virtues, habits, procedures, community, has precedence. That's constitution, and that's how John C. Calhoun used the word of a people, and indeed, which holds government in check, as we'll see on Thursday, and have seen before. Constitution is prior to government, the order of loyalties once again. Constitution is prior to government and orders and controls government as government orders and controls society. Yeah, Constitution is, no, so let's say, well, we'll get into that later. I don't want to be like Carrie, follow the hand. Not as good at it. So once again, community and its historic culture has priority. As Bradford explains, Rome, quote, Rome, for instance, was not made, but grew. It's a great line. This is the first chapter it's Roman History and the Nation, the first chapter in Bradford's Better Guide Than Reason, which is a book all of us should. We're reading another chapter of it in the seminars this week. Was not made but grew, Bradford continues. The ontological fact of Rome is rooted in familial piety and flourishing through patriotic zeal, was logically prior to any meaning it acquired. The self-respect, quote unquote, as Bradford says, quotation, of every Roman depended on his being a Roman. You weren't isolates. You weren't, as Dr. Fleming was saying earlier today, you weren't an individual and then you decided what you were going to be. You were that loyalty which grows along the line until it takes some sort of political shape at the end of the chain. Was being a Roman. The same was true for Britain, which, so conscious of its Roman heritage, looked back to the ancient Anglo-Saxon as the origin of its constitution in the full Calhounian sense. As a people, Washington kept a bust of the Roman historian Sallust on his desk. Here, Washington and Lee found their honor and their nature, being a Roman, found their nature. Though they understood their past, and through it, they envisioned their past and they understood their past and envisioned a responsible future. When General Burgoyne demanded surrender in 1777, Washington answered, quote, "The associated armies in America act from the noblest of motives, liberty. The same principles actuated the arms of Rome in the days of its glory, and the same object was the reward of Roman valor." To this, Bradford writes, pure Livy. He's taking it straight out of the Roman historian Livy. The greatest well, it sounds like Livy. It's not a direct quotation, of course. The great historians of the Roman Republic, Livy, Tacitus, Plutarch, and others, became a model for the political arrangement required of those brilliant, keen, and hopeful minds in Virginia that found themselves colonists in an agrarian community. History was a moral and political study, not 5 credits on an AP test. A moral and political study, as Bradford says, but was also the indispensable record of how to accomplish what they must do. They must build society forward into political order, follow their loyalties through to the end. The recent British political theorist Michael Oakeshott said, a great quotation, quote, the good cook is not someone who dreams up a pie and then tries to make it. The good cook is one who knows the basic ingredients of culinary activity, how it combines and brews for the best results, such as pies. The best results begin with the deep appreciation of basic cultures, culinary, and for non-cooks like myself, human community. With a determination to preserve and perfect them. Here the founders, are also following Aristotle, if I might switch to the Greeks for a moment, who said that societies grow naturally from family, and then to village, and then finally to polis, or which we can poorly translate as state, to be quick about it, with the basic loyalties of each one maintained and not swallowed up, as most of our contemporary world believes, especially the Republican Party. I'm getting into this because I think it's important if we're going to understand what Washington does and then what Lee does. We need to know this because I'm going to show you, we're going to talk about two very, very, very contemporary books that are trying their best to drive a wedge between Lee and Washington. Trying to drive a wedge as court historians into what I said at the outset is second nature to all of us. That they both share the same train of loyalty. So all of this is going someplace, I hope. Plato, whom the founders thought eschewed actual experience and accumulated wisdom in favor of the abstract good, what we can now call the a priori pie. I thought it was funny. Plato was completely, for this, despised, especially by Jefferson. I remember as a young graduate student listening to Jefferson just take off on Plato. I said, he's not that bad. Well, now I know why. The primary Roman source, Bradford reports, however, was the 12 Tables of the Law, 449 BC. I'm going to quote Bradford. This codification made official and permanent the replacement of the ancient kings by a by a prescriptive constitutional system. It was essentially a codification of existing customs and funded wisdom. Remember Carey's lecture. Funded wisdom from which all subsequent additions to their legal order drew their authority, another way of following out the train of loyalties. Accordingly, in a striking line of Bradford's, the tables, quote, objectified their will towards existence as community, end quote. It constituted them. It was their constitution prior to an official political constitution. It was, to cite Calhoun again, a constitution itself, in the strict meaning of the term. Finally, and once again, Rome was not made, it grew. Bradford argues that Romanitas had its deepest roots in the southern colonies, and this is because an agrarian society, such as Virginia's northern neck, is a true economy. Two Greek words, oikon nomos, means economy. What do the Greek stems mean? The way of the household. Sorry, I beat you to it. Sorry, Marjorie. The way of the household. It's how to bake a pie, how to raise the children, how to deliver a colt. The way of the household, the society that favors industry and technology and the profits they bring gradually loses interest, as we all know, in the economy of the family and eventually in gifted traditions and time-honored ways and stories of the human family. History is bunk, said Henry Ford. Joey's arm has 2 tattoos, sang James Wilson. And George Washington was a true agrarian. Though he wanted very much to attain the highest social stations, that in no way affected his love of family and land. In this society, early Southern society, advancement did not imply at all distancing yourself from the land. He grew up with family and neighbors close to the land and was especially renowned, like his great-great-nephew, for his equestrian abilities. He was known throughout his life, whether it was riding the Blue Ridge as a surveyor or whether it was riding through the streets of New York City on his way to become president. Agrarians have an indelible sense of place which becomes personal property, as these fields, these family tombstones on the property, this new colt or calf, this disastrous winter, all put together accrue to the eye, as the agrarian Andrew Lytle put it, accrue to the eye and become one's own. And if cut it out, Carl.
Powerful speaking.
Yeah, and if one does not learn the skills and masteries of virtuous ownership, the land and home will soon be gone, as is the case in the young, as was often the case in the young farming community in the Northern Neck. A pause to pontificate for a moment. Master, somebody calling another a master, comes from master craftsman. It's a medieval term for the one who knows how the whole oikon nomos fits together, whether that be somebody outside the home or somebody inside the home. That's the master craftsman. Doesn't mean boss. It means that you bear all of the responsibility for the working of the community, the home, and then the community. Boss is a word which pertains to factories and political parties. And speaking of parts fitting into one, a sign of Washington's early brilliance is found in his great skill and love of surveying. In his early teens, Lord Fairfax, in fact, sent him with just a handful of other people on a long expedition to survey the remote southern bank of the Potomac. This journey gave him a lifelong taste of the frontier, as the great biographer of Jefferson, Douglas Southall Freeman, put it. Washington stood on the Blue Ridge and looked across what seemed to be trackless land to the distant ranges of the Alleghanies, which only a handful of Europeans had beheld. Surveyor and his instruments of order, divine borders, encountered in a brand new world. Douglas Freeman's account of young Washington's expeditions, which is of all of his writing, is some of his very best. Young Washington's expedition is a parable of his vision of the American order and union. I'm going to quote now Douglas Freeman, 6 big, thick books, The Life of Washington. It's a fantastic reading. Washington did not have the eloquence to describe the nation's tomorrow, but he had glimpsed the edge of the great valley of Virginia, which students might not see over the top of their law books. And he had followed the routes by which the restless and the landless could enter and occupy this bountiful empire. He believed that if America had power to maintain law and revenue with which to pay her public debts, got him into a big fight with the North, as we'll see in a minute, she could prosper and assure a larger life for her sons and daughters. And then an important line of Freeman's as he tries to think Washington's thoughts as the nation's first president looks over the Shenandoah Valley in his youth. Quote, "A government strong enough to enforce the will of a free people is no tyrant. it would be a protector, end quote. This dream of an agrarian is one of a protector. It's one of a master craftsman, as he had proven to be after the French and Indian War when he returned to Virginia and his land. This selfless leadership and dutifulness, typical of those who are responsible to land, family, and tradition first, and are satisfied with their place in society, made him the immediate choice to lead the colonial forces against the British. Now, my research tells me that not a single man from the New England states was considered for this role, or was even deemed considerable. Northern concerns for financial profit plagued what here at this juncture, profits from war. Washington, I think most of us know, would not take a salary. He simply said, compensate me for any personal expenses, but I get no pay. And I'm going to read some passages in just a moment where he had a terrible time dealing with the urge for prophecy before, during, and after the war. On March 31st, 1779, he wrote to James Warren with complete frustration over Yankee concerns for personal gain and home state advantage. Quote, speculation, peculation, engrossing, forestalling, he wrote. The measure of iniquity is not yet filled, and unless we can return to first principle, I know not when it will be. Shall a few designing men for their own aggrandizement and to gratify their own avarice overset the goodly fabric we have been rearing at the expense of so much time and blood and treasure? Forbid it, heaven. Forbid it all in every state. Our cause is noble. It is the cause of mankind, and the danger to it is to be apprehended from ourselves. Parenthetically, one of the things I'm doing here is I'm giving some statements that's going to lead to Washington sounding like he wants a strong union, which he does, with a strong executive power, and that we're showing how Lee could not go that way finally when push came to shove. So all this is heading somewhere. Trying to build a place where I can fit Lee in quickly. Okay, then after the war, 1786, he wrote to Richard Henry Lee, I am mortified beyond expression when I view the clouds that have spread over the brightest morn that ever dawned upon any country. You talk, he said to Lee, of employing influence to appease these tumults in Massachusetts. I know not where that influence is to be found, he said. Influence is no government. Famous line of Washington's. The New England states, are determined to annihilate all public debts and private debts and want to rely entirely on paper currency and credit. Can you imagine that? Glad that's over with. He continues, how melancholy is the reflection in so short a space that we should have made such large strides towards fulfilling the prediction of our transatlantic foe, that it would all fall apart. Good God, he wrote David Humphreys in 1786, who besides a Tory could have foreseen or a Briton predicted such a situation? Who cannot but admire and approve such moral ire, especially from a man who thus described the cost of independence, which he saw at Valley Forge, quote, to see men who, without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced by the blood of their feet, and almost as often without provision as with, marching through frost and snow at Christmas, taking up their winter quarters within a day's march of the enemy, without a horse or even a hut. Washington's end quote. Washington's correspondence before, during, and after the war is filled with this fury, stemming from this agony he carried with him for the rest of his days, concerning the cost of the war and the great opportunity victory gave him for a new land of liberty, and the selfishness, put it quickly, of what he saw in several states, most of them in the North. Without a constitution, thus, without a strong federal government, here I'm building up something that people accuse the South is not wanting, along with the founder. Without a constitution, without a strong federal government to enforce the will of the people, we will be verging on anarchy and confusion, end quote. Washington did indeed want a strong central government in the new Union and advocated for it far and wide, often arguing against such Virginians and friends as George Mason and Patrick Henry. This advocacy of a strong Union is the latest wedge in the hands, I'm turning to Lee now, in the hands of revisionist historians to split Washington apart from the Confederacy, and particularly Robert E. Lee. Professor Gary Gallagher, in his recent work, it's called Becoming Confederates, Paths to a New National Loyalty. We talked about this when I talked about Lee in 2013. Gary Gallagher points out that Lee renounced the secession movement and stood staunchly by the Union until things got hot. Then he showed his true colors and sided with Virginia, slavery, and Southern secession. What's he done? He's chosen the abstraction first. Just watch how he's doing this. For Gallagher's ilk, political abstractions have precedent over local loyalties. And then just this past winter, a former speechwriter of President George W. Bush published a book on Lee with the far and extraordinarily clever title, The Man Who Would Not Be Washington. I mean, where did these people, it's so clever. In other words, if you don't get the joke, or if you don't get how serious this is, the man who would not be Washington. If Washington was the man who would not be king, then Lee was the man who would not be a founder. He got up to where push came to shove, and he backed away. This is the wedge that they're driving. Lately, these two books have just come out in the last 2 years. The Man Who Would Not Be Washington. Taking a page from Gallagher, this author, Jonathan Horn, reports that Lee, at the last minute, refused the union of Washington and fellow Virginians to stick with slavery and secession. Anybody want to do this for me? For both authors, I mean, these are serious books. I mean, they're not. People take them seriously, is what I should say. It'll win you tenure. As Lee said over and over, and most emphatically, when offered commander of the Union forces, he would not take up his sword against his own people. Remember, well, we know this from several lectures before this, that, let me just go ahead and say it, that up until the invasion, Virginia had not seceded, and that the invading forces, all illegally gathered by Lincoln, numbered 75,000 people, a fact that I only learned from my history friends here at Abbeville, more than the number that invaded Mexico. Lee thought it would be close to 100,000 people, troops. We need to pause and contemplate the nature of the mind that would find fault with Lee's decision, leave aside the mind that would publish his alleged dereliction and self-deception to the masses of college degree holding uneducated who prowl Barnes & Noble searching for anything to believe in. Pardon me for that. Isn't it obvious that to any moral person that a union, quote unquote, which allows the central government or state to invade another state is no union at all? It is a Dostoevskian abstraction that constantly threatens and often destroys that which is concrete, close, and the foundation of any real union. So, for instance, how many politicians today backpedal from their own policies, which caused the horrible fact that so many Americans have lost their jobs by exporting them overseas, but who cannot renounce the name globalism, the term globalism. They can't come out and say globalism's bad. What's bad is exporting jobs across. They can't move from the local to the abstraction. They can't. They abstract. It's just good. Just being global is good. Even the Federalist on steroids, as we have seen, Alexander Hamilton, in our seminar reading, said that the invasion of another state is unthinkable and a sign of a nation at war with itself. But let's get out our red pens and grade this case of Lee's, the man who would not be Washington, the man who would not become his hero. Lee would indeed use the words of a, let's say, staunch Federalist, to be quick about it, as he watched closely, this is important, the growing antagonism between the South and the new Republican Party and its administration. Quotation, "Secession is revolution. The framers of our Constitution never exhausted so much labor, wisdom, and forbearance in its formation and surrendered it with so many guards and securities if it was intended to be broken by every member of the Confederacy at will. It is idle to talk of secession." He's watching to see what's going to happen. But he also said, and this is never quoted, "Still, a union that can only be maintained by words and bayonets, and in which strife and civil war are to take the place of brotherly love and kindness, has no charm for me." What Lee is doing is he's getting at secession as a Federalist would by saying you attack a state and the union's broken. That's how he makes his case. And so, you know, the second-rate history writers simply read language and they see this huge difference, but there's no difference between what Lee did and what any Southerner who left the Union did. Let me take this on a few more minutes. That can be maintained by swords and bayonets, in which strife and civil war are to take the place of brotherly love and kindness, has no charm for me. And this is never quoted. "The South, in my opinion, has been aggrieved by the acts of the North. I feel the aggression and am willing to take every proper step of redress." He waited to see if the worst would happen, and he grieved at the ongoing destruction of Washington's legacy. There was no self-deception. After the war, when the worst had happened, it's an important passage, 1865. "If the result of the war is to be considered as having decided that the Union of States is inviolable and perpetual under the Constitution, it is as incompetent for the general government to impair its integrity by the exclusion of a state." You exclude the state and the Union's gone. If the war decided, if the war is to be considered as having decided that the Union of States is inviolable, if that's what the war has said, and perpetual under the Constitution, you're saying the exact same things, if I can put those words in Lee's mouth. It is just as incompetent for the general government to impair its integrity by the exclusion of a state as for the states to do so by secession. You're doing the exact same thing. "The existence and rights of a state by the Constitution are as indestructible as the Union itself. The legitimate consequence, then, must be the perfect equality of rights of all the states." M.E. Bradford sums this up very well. As old Whig as old Whig statesmen had said repeatedly from the England of 1628 and 1689 to America ran one unbroken prescription. One of the two parties to a legal connection cannot feel free to reinterpret the union for the sake of a private advantage. And if they make the attempt, the other party is released from all obligations. You don't even have to make a decree. It's over. Indeed, even the threat of such aggrandizement is sufficient to require separation. End quote, Bradford. That Washington would be in total agreement follows directly from this and from all that we have seen so far, especially this movement of loyalties to the political order. To George Mason, he wrote, at a time when our lordly masters, this is prior to the Revolution, at a time when our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the deprecation of American freedom, it seems highly necessary that something should be done to avert the stroke and maintain the liberty which we have derived from the ancestors. Colonies have rights. No man, to continue the quotation, no man should scruple or hesitate a moment to use arms in defense of so valuable a blessing on which all the good and evil of life depend. All the good and evil of life depend. It is not a tea tax. It is not a tea tax which is driving us. Those who want to divide Washington from Lee mention ad nauseum that Washington also advocated an indissoluble union, and indeed he did use those words. But reread the above, and if it becomes a union in name only, then there is no union at all at that point. It's gone. When asked to explain what he meant by indissoluble, he wrote that the union would be as indissoluble as the link between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage, between the genuine maxims of a genuine and magnanimous policy, and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity. And since we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the external rules of right order which heaven itself has ordained, and since the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the republican form of government are considered as deeply, as finally, staked in the experience entrusted to the hands of the American people. Lee was perfectly correct, according to Washington. An attack on true union is at best anarchy. True union, but the invasion of the South rendered a union in name only, and therefore no union at all, just an abstraction with nothing to it but the power lie. Every brave people, Lee said after the war, who considered their rights attacked and their constitutional liberties invaded would have done as we did. Our conduct was not caused by any insurrectionary spirit, nor can it be termed rebellion. M.E. Bradford has the last word, a great closing comment. In his last days, all Lee could add to this eloquent simplicity, was that he could not repent the choice and would repeat it if the circumstances recurred. Washington was his model as a public man, and Washington would have done no other, end quote, Bradford. If Lee was a Southerner, so was Washington.